A single locomotive costs more than most homes on your street, $3 to $5 million. Then a derailment flips it into a ditch in under 4 seconds. What happens to that money? A brand new AC traction road locomotive is a rolling assembly of specialized engineering, representing an investment of $3 to $5 million. When a railroad purchases one of these machines, they are paying for highly integrated systems, advanced microprocessors, massive diesel engines, and heavy-duty alternators built to pull thousands of tons. This purchase price reflects a pristine asset operating at peak efficiency on a clear track. But when a derailment occurs, that clean slate valuation instantly disappears. In a few chaotic seconds, an intact asset becomes a wreckage resting in the dirt. At this exact moment, the original purchase price ceases to dictate its worth. The financial calculation shifts from replacement value to an entirely unknown variable: the post-crash residual value. The owner is suddenly left with a complex financial calculation. The physical asset has changed form, but the underlying capital remains trapped in the debris. Some of the expensive internal systems inside the wreckage might still be functional, while others are completely destroyed. The actual loss is separate from the original sticker price. The immediate question is how much of that multi-million-dollar investment can be recovered from the wreckage, and how much has vanished into the dirt. The physical scale of this machinery is immense. A General Electric ES44 AC tips the scales at approximately 432,000 pounds. Its primary industry rival, the Locomotive diesel SD70 ACE, operates on a similarly massive scale, weighing up to 411,000 pounds. When these modern road units derail, recovery teams face the challenge of managing more than 200 tons of concentrated steel, wiring, and fluids per locomotive. Because modern freight operations rely on multiple coupled units, a single major derailment routinely entangles 3 or 4 locomotives at once. This creates an immediate asset exposure of up to $20 million, even before determining if the units are total losses. The sheer mass of these machines complicates every aspect of the physical recovery. Lifting, transport, and re-railing demand extreme crane capacities, while the fallen engines cause severe ground disturbance, sinking deep into the track bed. The load-bearing frame and running gear are designed to distribute this weight under normal operation, supporting a complex internal system. This power path begins with a diesel-fueled prime mover generating mechanical power, converts it to electricity through a main alternator, and routes it directly to high-voltage traction motors on the axles. When this 200-ton power plant leaves the rails, that carefully engineered distribution of mass is completely disrupted. The physical wreckage is a secondary problem. For the railroad, the immediate crisis is not the disabled machine, but the severed artery of the network itself. Freight rail operates as a highly synchronized web of scheduled train paths, crew rotations, sorting yards, interchange points, and time-sensitive shipper commitments. When a derailment blocks a main line, this delicate system fractures instantly. A blocked corridor immediately deletes available train paths, forcing following traffic to wait, reroute, or short terminate. The financial toll cascades with every minute of delay. Stranded crews exhaust their federally mandated service hours and must be replaced, requiring extra transport and standby pay. Rerouted trains burn additional fuel, complicate regional dispatching, and cause heavy wear on secondary alternative routes. Beyond these operational headaches, railroads face steep contractual penalties for delayed freight, particularly with premium intermodal shippers. This operational pressure is driven by a stark mathematical reality. The value of a clear track quickly outstrips the value of any locomotive. A single busy corridor can generate up to $30 million in freight revenue per hour, meaning a 24-hour blockage can translate to a gross economic disruption of $700 million. While a nationwide rail shutdown carries an estimated macroeconomic impact of over $2 billion per day, according to the Association of American Railroads, even local corridor blockages create financial losses that make a $3 to $5 million locomotive look like a rounding error. This massive disparity shapes every decision made from the dispatch center. The railroad must distinguish between the gross disruption to the logistics network and its own direct lost profits. But both metrics point toward a single, urgent goal. The priority is restoring at least one safe track to get traffic moving again. Completing thorough investigative work, assessing mechanical damage, or executing full environmental remediation are important, but they are deferred. Until the main line is reopened, the ruined multi-million-dollar asset on the side of the tracks is treated not as a valuable piece of engineering, but as an obstacle to be bypassed. Heavy-duty bulldozers and massive side boom cranes roar to life at the edge of the derailment site, their operators waiting for the signal from the field wrecking supervisor. When a multi-million-dollar locomotive blocks a main line, delicate extraction is a luxury the network cannot afford. The immediate objective is not preservation, it is rapid displacement. The wrecking supervisor must quickly select recovery gear based on the terrain, the locomotive's physical orientation, and access constraints. In some cases, teams deploy 1,200 kilonewton crawler cranes, hydraulic jacks, heavy spreaders, or specialized skates to slide the massive wheels onto temporary rails. In others, they rely on raw horsepower to drag the wreckage clear. Before any steel is moved, the recovery crew must isolate electrical systems, stabilize fuel tanks, and secure track protection. They must coordinate contractors, railroad personnel, and hazardous material responders on a crowded, high-hazard site. This is controlled brute force recovery. It is a systematic, speed-prioritized operation, rather than a series of random impacts. When the main line is blocked, the supervisor often makes the calculated decision to accept severe structural and cosmetic damage to the locomotive shell, if it means opening the track sooner. Dragging a 200-ton machine through the dirt, or slicing through its bodywork with oxy-fuel cutting torches can easily add $500,000 to $1 million in extra damage. But from an economic standpoint, this is a highly rational trade-off. Incurring $1 million in additional equipment damage is a minor setback when a blocked high-traffic corridor threatens to rack up tens of millions of dollars in network delays and penalty fees every hour. The priority is clearing rail lines, bridges, crossings, or emergency routes rather than preserving the exterior shell. The wrecking supervisor operates under immense pressure, balanced by strict safety, environmental, and regulatory boundaries. If a preservation notice from federal investigators is active, or if a ruptured fuel tank poses an immediate chemical spill risk, the supervisor's authority to move the equipment is temporarily restricted, but once the green light is given, the priority remains absolute. The steel shell is treated as a temporary obstruction, cleared away so the main line can breathe. Once the wreckage is pulled clear of the main line, the priority shifts from raw clearance to forensic engineering. The wrecking supervisor steps aside, and the mechanical assessor takes control of the site to answer a single, multi-million-dollar question. Has the backbone of the locomotive survived? The main underframe is the structural foundation of the entire machine. It must support a 60,000-pound prime mover, handle thousands of gallons of fuel, and withstand up to 800,000 pounds of draft gear compression force during normal train operations. This load-bearing frame distributes the massive weight across the trucks, cab support structures, fuel tank brackets, and cross members. If this core structure remains straight and sound, the locomotive is a candidate for repair or a complete rebuild. If it is warped, twisted, or cracked, the machine's career on the main line is effectively over. The physical inspection begins with visual and dimensional measurements of the frame rails, cross members, draft gear, and critical truck connections. Technicians sweep the steel, using non-destructive methods like ultrasonic and magnetic particle testing to expose microfissures hidden deep within the metal. Even if the frame looks straight to the naked eye, the sheer force of a derailment can knock the massive diesel engine and its heavy crankshaft out of alignment by fractions of an inch. A misaligned crankshaft will warp bearings and destroy a prime mover within hours of operation, making engine alignment checks a critical concern. A common misconception in the rail industry suggests a Universal Federal Railroad Administration rule dictates that any frame buckle of more than a half-inch is an automatic write-off. In reality, no such universal regulatory cutoff exists in the FRA books. Instead, FRA rules require the underframe to remain elastic under severe compressive loads to preserve a safe survival space in the cab. If an engineering assessment reveals severe permanent deformation, the frame cannot be trusted to perform safely in a future collision. This practical safety limit makes a half-inch buckle a de facto total loss. Straightening a warped frame requires specialized hydraulic jigs, heat treatment, and intensive precision welding that can easily run up hundreds of hours of labor and tens of thousands of dollars. If the estimated cost of these structural repairs approaches 30 to 40% of the unit's depreciated book value, the investment is no longer rational. Cosmetic damage to the cab, nose, or fiberglass hoods looks catastrophic on camera, but those parts are easily unbolted and replaced. It is the hidden, permanent set in the structural deck that separates a simple re-railing and cosmetic structural repair from a total write-off. The mechanical assessment must wait if federal authorities intervene. Under Title 49, Code of Federal Regulations, Section 831, the National Transportation Safety Board holds immediate, exclusive authority to investigate significant rail accidents. This mandate gives the NTSB the legal power to examine, test, and seize any physical component of the wreckage. At the same time, the Federal Railroad Administration provides safety oversight under Part 225, coordinating closely with NTSB investigators on the scene. While the railroad's financial incentive demands immediate track restoration, federal law forces a delicate balance. Section 831, subsection B2, requires the NTSB to preserve safety-critical evidence while trying to minimize interference with active transportation services. This statutory compromise creates a clear separation between operational clearance and formal evidence release. While heavy machinery can push the wrecked locomotives off the rails to let trains pass, the physical assets themselves remain under a strict legal freeze. During this freeze, the on-scene team initiates a rigorous chain of custody. The most safety-sensitive items are secured first. Investigators locate and extract the event recorders, placing them in tamper-evident containers for secure transport to specialized analysis laboratories. Alongside the digital data, physical wreckage serves as forensic proof. Teams catalog the damage patterns of wheel sets, overheated roller bearings, shattered track components, and electronic control systems to identify fracture lines and stress patterns that occurred before the impact. These agencies do not automatically seize every piece of wreckage, but they can sequester key assemblies for months. In the East Palestine derailment, for example, the NTSB retained custody of the event recorders from the day of the crash in February 2023 until the release of the final report in June 2024. A 12-month administrative hold. Until investigators formally rescind their preservation notices, the railroad is legally prohibited from altering, repairing, or dismantling the locomotives. This legal holding pattern completely suspends any plans for remanufacturing or salvage. But while the legal investigation moves slowly, another urgent environmental clock is already ticking. Stored inside the derailed machines, thousands of gallons of trapped industrial fluids present an immediate threat to the surrounding environment. The moment investigators release their hold on the physical wreckage, Control of the site shifts from forensic evidence gathering to environmental response. An environmental coordinator steps in, tasked with assigning real costs to invisible contamination. A typical modern road locomotive is a rolling warehouse of industrial liquids. A single fully loaded unit carries an inventory of approximately 5,000 gallons of diesel fuel, 450 gallons of lubricating oil, and 600 gallons of diesel exhaust fluid. While the exact quantities vary depending on the locomotive model, the starting fuel level, and the specific forces of the impact, these fluids represent an immediate, high-stakes liability. Beyond the primary fuel and exhaust systems, response teams must manage hundreds of gallons of chemical engine coolant, hydraulic fluids, and the corrosive acid contained within the massive lead-acid batteries. If these materials breach their containment tanks during a derailment, they saturate the ballast and sink rapidly into the ground. The immediate response requires fast deployment of containment booms, absorbent pads, and temporary earthen dikes, while technicians perform continuous air monitoring to detect toxic fumes. Crews use vacuum trucks and high-capacity pumps to extract any remaining bulk liquids from the ruptured tanks before the locomotive is moved. Once the standing liquids are pumped out, the methodical process of site restoration begins. Technicians collect core soil samples to map the boundaries of the subterranean plume. Excavators then dig up thousands of cubic yards of contaminated soil, loading it into specialized regulated transport vehicles for shipment to licensed hazardous waste treatment facilities. After the physical dirt is removed, long-term groundwater monitoring wells must be drilled to track potential chemical migration. These environmental obligations continue long after the cleared tracks reopen. The cost of soil excavation, regulated transport, specialized disposal fees, and follow-up groundwater monitoring can easily run into hundreds of thousands of dollars per unit. For railroads, these liabilities are deducted directly from the projected salvage value of the equipment. In many cases, the expense of cleaning and restoring a single contaminated site completely consumes or exceeds any money recovered by salvaging the underlying machinery. This risk is entirely separate from the high-profile hazardous cargo the train might be hauling in its freight cars. Even a train carrying harmless paper or grain presents an immediate, expensive hazmat threat simply from the industrial fluids required to keep its own 200-ton engines running. When federal investigators officially release the physical wreckage and the immediate cleanup ends, the railroad moves to get the asset off its books. Holding onto a heavily damaged, non-operational machine on active property makes no financial sense. Instead of managing the disposal internally, Class I railroads route the wrecked units through specialized asset disposition channels, introducing them to a highly targeted secondary market. This market consists of qualified buyers, primarily specialist salvage yards, rolling stock brokers, and independent rebuilders. Rather than pricing these machines as functioning locomotives, these buyers price the high degree of uncertainty associated with severe crash damage. The transactions are almost always structured as is, where is lot sales. Under these terms, the buyer agrees to take possession of the locomotive exactly where it sits, accepting all physical, logistical, and environmental liabilities from the moment the contract is signed. Because the equipment is often stored in remote sidings or secure facilities, these sales regularly occur through negotiated bids or sight-unseen auctions before a complete mechanical teardown can take place. Buyers must calculate their offers using limited photos, basic field reports, and external structural assessments. This lack of complete information is reflected in steep pricing adjustments. While a lightly damaged unit might trade at a moderate discount, severely compromised wrecks routinely command discounts ranging from 30% to 70% off their remaining depreciated book value. This transaction is less about creating immediate value and more about transferring risk. The railroad accepts a low cash offer to eliminate further liability and clear its ledger. The buyer, in turn, accepts the chance of hidden frame cracks, warped internal shafts, contaminated parts, and the logistical challenge of transporting a disabled 200-ton machine. A transaction that represents a total write-off to a major railroad becomes a calculated opportunity for a specialist. Once the contract is signed, the buyer takes physical possession, preparing the ruined machine for transport to a dedicated inspection facility. At the teardown facility, the recovery process shifts from heavy logistics to precision industrial disassembly. When a structural assessment confirms that a locomotive's frame is compromised, the machine can never return to mainline service as an intact unit. Even so, its internal systems often remain fully functional. Cannibalization becomes the default operational strategy. By systematically stripping the wrecked shell, operators can recover specialized assemblies that carry a collective market value far higher than the ruined physical carcass. The primary asset in this harvesting process is the prime mover. A salvageable diesel engine can be refurbished or completely rebuilt, carrying an indicative rebuilt market value of $750,000 to $900,000. Below the frame, technicians target the high-voltage drivetrain. The 6 AC traction motors that drive the wheels represent an aggregate indicative value of $1.2 to $1.5 million when restored. These motors are housed within the massive truck assemblies. Each truck, including its cast steel frame, wheel sets, roller bearings, suspension components, and brake rigging, is valued at approximately $300,000. The electrical generation and control systems yield further high-value recoveries. The main alternator, which converts the diesel engine's mechanical horsepower into electricity, carries an indicative value approaching $150,000. Surrounding this central generator are modular auxiliary components, such as fuel system modules and microprocessor-based electronic control cabinets, which represent tens of thousands of dollars in additional recovered capital. When combined, these individual components can easily total more than $2 million, far exceeding the net scrap value of the damaged steel shell. But these pricing tiers represent gross market indications rather than guaranteed cash proceeds. The true salvage yield is governed by the physical condition of the wreckage. Sudden impact forces, intense thermal exposure from fuel fires, or water contamination from emergency response efforts ultimately determine component usability. Converting these parts into realized capital also requires substantial investment. The gross value of any harvested assembly is heavily reduced by the costs of diagnostic testing, physical extraction labor, specialized heavy transport, component rebuilding, climate-controlled storage, and the long-term liability of providing parts warranties. Because of these recovery costs, Class I railroads frequently opt for internal retention instead of an external sale. By absorbing these certified assemblies back into their own maintenance networks, railroads avoid third-party markups and immediately bypass supply chain delays, directly using the parts of a written-off locomotive to keep the rest of their active fleet moving. If the structural assessment confirms the underframe has survived without permanent deformation, the locomotive escapes the scrapyard and enters a specialized remanufacturing facility. Here, the surviving steel deck serves as the foundation for an entirely rebuilt machine. The process begins with a complete strip-down. Technicians tear away the damaged cab, the crumpled nose, the ruptured fuel tanks, and any compromised cooling components. They strip the frame clean until it is a bare black slab of structural steel. Workers then clean, blast, and inspect every square inch of this foundation, using ultrasonic waves to search for microscopic stress fractures that visual inspections might miss. Once the frame is certified sound, the rebuilding phase begins. Technicians install a replacement or completely rebuilt diesel engine onto the frame. They mount renewed main alternators and install newly overhauled AC traction motors inside rebuilt truck frames. The team routes miles of fresh, heavy-duty electrical wiring through the underframe channels, connecting the power plant to a brand new microprocessor control cabinet. A fresh cooling hatch, complete with new radiators and fans, is bolted onto the rear. At the front, workers install a completely new cab module, complete with reinforced collision posts, crash refuge structures, and modern control consoles. Reusing the existing frame is a competitive alternative to buying a new locomotive. While a brand new road unit costs approximately $4 to $5 million, a comprehensive remanufacture program can be completed for about half that amount, often around $2 to over $2.5 million. This path also bypasses the long lead times of manufacturer order backlogs, allowing railroads to return a high-value asset to the rails in a matter of months rather than years. However, railroads do not rebuild every salvageable frame. The decision to remanufacture depends on a selective alignment of factors: the unit's age, parts availability, the immediate service needs of the fleet, and the specific historical profile of the locomotive. Even a unit involved in a fatal collision can return to the main line. Once the federal investigation concludes, the wreckage is released, and the structural integrity of the frame is verified, the rebuild can proceed. Before any remanufactured unit is allowed to pull freight again, it must pass a rigorous battery of mechanical, electrical, safety, and operational tests. The locomotive undergoes high-voltage load testing to verify its power output, followed by grid braking tests and comprehensive air brake calibration. Once the Federal Railroad Administration certifies the machine, it is cleared to return to revenue service. Depending on railroad preference and regulatory standards, the rebuilt locomotive may retain its original road number and asset identity, or it may receive a new designation on the company ledger. It returns to the main line as a fully modernized machine ready for decades of heavy haul service. When the underframe is warped beyond salvage and every high-value component has been harvested, the remaining steel shell reaches its absolute material floor. For a standard 200-ton road unit, the physical bulk of the machine is now reduced to raw commodity weight. During the fourth quarter of 2023, the U.S. average price for heavy melting steel hovered at approximately $550 per short ton. On paper, this translates to a gross steel value of about $110,000. But a dismantling contractor is an industrial material processor, not a destroyer, and converting a 400,000-pound steel frame into meltable furnace feed requires immense operational effort. Before the first shear bites into the deck, the processor must extract any remaining high-value non-ferrous metals, like copper and aluminum, along with any reusable hardware. Then, the real processing begins. Transporting the oversized wreck to a specialized salvage yard, executing heavy oxy-fuel cutting, and managing the careful removal and disposal of residual cutting fluids and hazardous materials incurs heavy overhead. These mandatory deductions for transport, cutting, defluiding, and waste disposal routinely consume between $75,000 and $100,000 per unit. Because of these expenses, the actual net scrap return received by the railroad frequently falls to a modest $10,000 to $20,000. This final return is highly sensitive to regional market dynamics, steel grade variations, and rapid date fluctuations in heavy melt scrap indices. Comparing a $10,000 to $20,000 scrap payout to a modern locomotive's original $4 million asset benchmark makes the true nature of this transaction clear. Scrap serves as the absolute material floor for a written-off machine, rather than a recovery of the prior asset value. Once a locomotive reaches this terminal stage, the goal is no longer about reclaiming the lost millions of the active asset. It is simply about reducing the final physical carcass to zero, wrapping up the outstanding liability, and letting the raw metal return to the industrial furnace. The final destination of a wrecked locomotive does not depend on a standard insurance adjuster. Major Class I railroads do not buy off-the-shelf insurance policies for their fleets. Instead, they operate through massive self-insured retention layers, retaining the vast majority of their crash and liability risks on their own balance sheets. BNSF retains a $100 million deductible. Union Pacific maintains a $75 million retention per incident, while Norfolk Southern carries an $80 million layer per claim. CSX operates with a $50 million aggregate deductible. And Canadian Pacific Kansas City self-insures 90% of its locomotive loss exposure, holding a $30 million excess layer for the remainder. Self-insurance represents internally funded retained risk, rather than an absence of accounting or risk control protocols. Because the financial hit is absorbed directly on the company balance sheet, the railroad bypasses the slow, administrative approval processes of external insurance companies. The entire decision-making process converges on two corporate desks, the internal asset manager and the chief mechanical officer. These executives convert weeks of engineering, environmental, and operational reports into a single, decisive disposition. The asset manager runs a complex financial calculation. They do not look at the physical damage in isolation. Instead, they weigh a matrix of conflicting numbers: the locomotive's depreciated book value, its current fair market value, the cost of a brand new replacement, the projected downtime, environmental remediation liabilities, and the potential yield of salvaged parts. Each metric points to a different economic path. While the depreciated book value of a mid-life road unit might sit at $2 million, its actual replacement cost is over $4 million. If structural repairs cost $800,000, that represents 40% of the book value, the typical threshold where a repair becomes financially unviable. Yet, if the fleet is short on active power, the opportunity cost of a long-term service disruption might justify the high repair bill. The asset manager translates these variables into a projected net recovery. Once the calculations are complete, the chief mechanical officer reviews the mechanical feasibility, validates the safety implications, and signs off on the final technical plan. Because no outside insurer is required to approve each step, this corporate team can act with absolute speed. They decide whether to repair, remanufacture, cannibalize, or scrap the asset, completing the circle of risk management that began the moment the wheels left the rail. Outside the commercial choices of rebuild shops and scrap shears, a tiny fraction of crashed or retired locomotives escape destruction to serve a completely different purpose. These rare survivors cross over into the public sphere, ending up as historical artifacts in museums or specialized tools for emergency responders. For museum curators, the value of a wrecked unit is not found in its operational machinery, but in its historical identity and design. An acquisition might occur through a direct corporate donation or a heavily discounted private sale. Instead of undergoing a costly mechanical restoration, these locomotives are prepared for static display. Crews preserve the exterior cab, the distinctive bodywork, and the visual character of the machine, while leaving the complex internal traction and operating systems completely inactive. Another non-commercial pathway turns these massive machines into training tools for first responders. A damaged locomotive shell, stripped of its valuable internals, becomes a realistic prop for firefighters, rescue teams, and hazardous material units. These static training aids allow personnel to practice cutting through reinforced steel, maneuvering in tight, confined cab spaces, and managing simulated chemical leaks. But preparing a locomotive for public display or emergency training is a complex logistical task. Before any transfer of ownership can occur, the railroad must execute thorough decontamination. Workers must scrub away all toxic residues, drain residual fuel and oils, and remove any remaining mechanical or electrical hazards. Once stabilized, the massive steel body must be transported to its final home, a process requiring heavy-haul logistics, specialized cranes, and sometimes a direct financial subsidy from the donor railroad to cover the non-commercial transport costs. While historical accounts indicate possible donations to prominent national museums or acquisitions by specialized fire academies, such arrangements require strict institutional verification and represent exceptional circumstances rather than standard industry procedures. For a Class 1 railroad, donating a 200-ton machine or selling it as a training prop represents a complete departure from normal asset recovery. These paths generate no operational value, recover no valuable parts, and bypass the traditional salvage ledger, serving instead as a quiet end for a machine that once pulled thousands of tons across the continent. The physical and operational life cycle of a wrecked locomotive follows a tightly controlled chain of custody, where every critical decision is balanced against the immediate demands of the transportation network. From the moment of derailment, the machine's status shifts constantly, first as an urgent physical obstruction to be cleared by brute force, then as a legal hold for federal safety investigators, a containment site for hazardous fluids, and finally as an asset to be rebuilt on its original frame or dismantled for its high-value internal systems. Safety standards, regulatory evidence demands, and environmental containment protocols set strict outer limits on the speed of recovery. But they do not alter the fundamental economic reality driving the entire process. A written-off road unit can be remanufactured to pull freight once again, stripped of its valuable prime mover and traction motors to support the active fleet, or reduced to raw steel in a scrap furnace. None of these outcomes are decided in a vacuum. The physical damage to the cab, the frame, or the engine block is merely one data point in a much larger logistical equation. After a crash, a locomotive's value is not determined by the damage alone. It is determined by how fast the railroad needs the track back. Everything else is cleanup. Today, as global supply chains stretch thinner, the race to clear the rails never stops. With Class 1 railroads absorbing their own multi-million-dollar losses, a wrecked locomotive is no longer a mechanical tragedy, but a calculated cost of doing business. Ultimately, the true value of these steel giants lies in the velocity of the network they serve. The tracks must keep moving at any cost. What do you think of this high-stakes calculus? Share your thoughts below.